They called him the enemy janitor and made jokes about his Vietnamese accent. Until a visiting colonel saw the dragon tattoo behind his ear and realized they'd been mocking one of America's greatest allies. Welcome to Still Human. Before we begin this powerful story of prejudice, recognition, and the allies we forgot to honor, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us remember those who served alongside us in silence. The mop bucket wheels squeaked as Frank Wynne pushed it down the polished hallway of Fort Braxton military training base. The sound echoed off the walls like a metronome, marking time. 5 years of the same route, the same routine, the same invisible existence. At 73, Frank moved with the deliberate care of someone whose body remembered harder days, but his shoulders stayed straight, his eyes alert. The young soldiers barely noticed him. When they did, it was usually with the casual dismissal reserved for maintenance staff. Morning mop, they'd call out, using the nickname that had stuck since his first day. Some said it with good humor, others with the slight edge that came from seeing his weathered Asian features and hearing his accent. But what they didn't know was that Frank's silence wasn't submission. It was survival. Frank had learned long ago that being invisible was sometimes the greatest skill a man could possess. In Vietnam, it had kept him alive. In America, it had kept him employed. He spoke only when spoken to, kept his head down, and pushed his mop bucket through a world that had decided who he was the moment they heard him speak. "Excuse me, sir," he would say, in carefully measured English, when soldiers blocked his path. His accent was thick, unmistakable, marking him as foreign in a place where foreign often meant enemy. The younger recruits would sometimes mimic his pronunciation behind his back, drawing out the vowels in exaggerated mockery. What they didn't realize was that this man had once spoken perfect English, before bombs and screaming had damaged his hearing, before shrapnel had torn through his throat. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres was the worst of them, a cocky 28-year-old from Texas who'd done 2 tours in Afghanistan and thought that made him an expert on war. He'd started calling Frank Charlie after the Viet Cong radio designation, and the name had caught on with some of the younger recruits. "Hey Charlie," Torres would call out when Frank entered the mess hall with his cleaning supplies. "You miss the old country? Still got family in the tunnels?" Frank would simply nod and continue his work. Wiping down tables with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. The jokes stung, but he'd endured worse, much worse. The truth was, Frank did miss Vietnam, but not for the reasons they thought. One afternoon in July, as Frank cleaned the recreation room, where off-duty soldiers played pool and watched TV, Torres and 3 of his buddies were particularly loud. They'd been drinking beer and swapping war stories, their voices carrying the false bravado that comes from safety and distance. "I'm telling you," Torres was saying, "these Vietnamese, they're all the same. Sneaky little bastards. Could never trust 'em in the war. Can't trust 'em now." Private Williams, barely 19, and trying to impress his sergeant, chimed in. "Yeah. Like, why do we even let this guy on base? He could be anyone. Could be VC for all we know." Frank's hand tightened on his mop handle, but he kept cleaning. Torres noticed Frank nearby and raised his voice deliberately. "Isn't that right, Charlie? You ever kill any Americans back in Nam? Or were you too busy hiding in rice paddies?" Frank looked up slowly, his dark eyes meeting Torres's for just a moment. "I clean floor now," he said quietly, his accent thick with controlled emotion. "I clean floor now," Torres mimicked, exaggerating every syllable. "Jesus, 30 years in this country, and that's all the English you got." The other soldiers laughed, but something in Frank's expression made Williams uncomfortable. There was something in the old man's eyes, not fear or anger, but a kind of tired sadness that seemed deeper than the moment deserved. What Williams didn't know was that he was looking into the eyes of a man who had watched friends die in his arms. Frank finished cleaning the room in silence and pushed his cart toward the door. As he reached the threshold, he paused and turned back to Torres. "You know nothing about Vietnam," he said quietly, his accent softer now, but his words perfectly clear. "You know nothing about war." Then he left, leaving behind a room that had suddenly gone very quiet. That night, Colonel James Harrison arrived at Fort Braxton for an unscheduled inspection. Harrison was old-school military, Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart recipient, and a man who commanded respect through presence rather than volume. At 68, he still carried himself like the infantry officer he'd been 50 years ago, but his eyes held the weight of memories that never fully faded. He'd come to evaluate the training protocols after reports of discipline issues among the newer recruits. What he found was a generation of soldiers who knew tactics and technology, but had never learned respect. What he didn't expect was to encounter a ghost from his past. The next morning, as Harrison conducted his walkthrough of the facilities, he noticed Frank working in the main corridor. Nothing unusual there. Every base had maintenance staff. But something about the man's posture, the way he moved, triggered a memory that Harrison couldn't quite place. "Soldier," Harrison called to Torres, who was leading the tour. "Who's the maintenance worker?" Torres glanced dismissively at Frank. "That's just Charlie, sir. Vietnamese guy. Been here about 5 years. Good with a mop, terrible with English." Harrison studied Frank more carefully. There was something familiar about the way the man held himself, something that reminded him of... No, it couldn't be. Later that afternoon, everything changed. Frank was in the base barber shop, getting his monthly haircut from Joe Martinez, the base barber who'd been cutting military hair for 30 years. It was one of the few places on base where Frank felt somewhat welcome. Joe treated all his customers the same, regardless of rank or accent. "You want the usual, Frank?" Joe asked. Cape snapped around Frank's shoulders. Frank nodded. "Same as always." As Joe worked, cutting away the gray hair that had grown over Frank's ears, Harrison entered the shop for his own trim. He sat in the waiting area, half reading a magazine, half watching the rhythmic motion of the scissors. That's when he saw it. As Joe trimmed the hair behind Frank's left ear, a small mark became visible. Dark ink on weathered skin, barely larger than a thumbprint. A dragon. Not the flashy, colorful dragons popular in modern tattoo parlors, but something older, more specific. Military ink from a different era. Harrison's magazine fell from his hands. He knew that tattoo. He'd seen it only once before, on the neck of a Vietnamese Special Forces operator who had saved his life in the Mekong Delta in 1971. It was the mark of the LLDB, Luc Luong Doc Biet, the South Vietnamese Special Forces, but not just any LLDB unit. This specific dragon design was used only by the Phoenix program operatives, the elite Vietnamese soldiers who worked directly with American forces on the most dangerous missions. Harrison's blood went cold as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, loud enough for both Frank and Joe to hear. Frank's eyes met Harrison's in the barbershop mirror. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Frank's hand instinctively reached toward his ear, but it was too late. The colonel had seen everything. "Finish the cut," Harrison said quietly to Joe, never taking his eyes off Frank. "Then give us the room." Joe, sensing the tension, worked quickly and silently. When he finished, he removed Frank's cape and, without a word, stepped outside and locked the door behind him. The two men sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, Harrison spoke. "Tiger Team 7, Mekong Delta, March 15th, 1971. Frank's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "You remember." "I remember everything about that day," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember the ambush. I remember taking shrapnel in my leg. I remember thinking I was going to die in that goddamn swamp." Frank turned in the barber chair to face him directly. "You remember the man who carried you out?" Torres glanced dismissively at Frank. "That's just Charlie, sir. Vietnamese guy. Been here about 5 years. Good with the mop. Terrible with English." Harrison studied Frank more carefully. There was something familiar about the way the man held himself, something that reminded him of... No, it couldn't be. Later that afternoon, everything changed. Frank was in the base barber shop, getting his monthly haircut from Joe Martinez, the base barber who'd been cutting military hair for 30 years. It was one of the few places on base where Frank felt somewhat welcome. Joe treated all his customers the same, regardless of rank or accent. "You want the usual, Frank?" Joe asked. Cape snapped around Frank's shoulders. Frank nodded, same as always. As Joe worked, cutting away the gray hair that had grown over Frank's ears, Harrison entered the shop for his own trim. He sat in the waiting area, half reading a magazine, half watching the rhythmic motion of the scissors. That's when he saw it. As Joe trimmed the hair behind Frank's left ear, a small mark became visible. Dark ink on weathered skin, barely larger than a thumbprint. A dragon. Not the flashy, colorful dragons popular in modern tattoo parlors, but something older, more specific. Military ink from a different era. Harrison's magazine fell from his hands. He knew that tattoo. He'd seen it only once before, on the neck of a Vietnamese Special Forces operator who had saved his life in the Mekong Delta in 1971. It was the mark of the LLDB, Luc Luong Doc Biet, the South Vietnamese Special Forces. But not just any LLDB unit. This specific dragon design was used only by the Phoenix Program operatives, the elite Vietnamese soldiers who worked directly with American forces on the most dangerous missions. Harrison's blood went cold as recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Son of a bitch," he whispered, loud enough for both Frank and Joe to hear. Frank's eyes met Harrison's in the barbershop mirror. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Frank's hand instinctively reached toward his ear, but it was too late. The colonel had seen everything. "Finish the cut," Harrison said quietly to Joe, never taking his eyes off Frank. "Then give us the room." Joe, sensing the tension, worked quickly and silently. When he finished, he removed Frank's cape and without a word stepped outside and locked the door behind him. The two men sat in silence for what felt like hours. Finally, Harrison spoke. "Tiger Team 7, Mekong Delta, March 15th, 1971. Frank's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. "You remember." "I remember everything about that day," Harrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember the ambush. I remember taking shrapnel." "I want to tell you about a soldier," Harrison began, "a man who served with distinction in one of the most dangerous conflicts this country has ever been involved in. A man who saved dozens of American lives, who performed acts of heroism that most of you can't even imagine." The room was completely silent. This soldier worked behind enemy lines. He spoke 4 languages fluently. He was a medic, a scout, a sniper, and an intelligence operative. He was awarded the Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Silver Star, the equivalent of our own Silver Star, not once but 3 times. Harrison paused, scanning the crowd. He was also awarded something else, something that very few people outside of classified military circles have ever heard of: the Phoenix Dragon, a commendation given only to South Vietnamese operatives who served directly with American forces in joint operations. Torres shifted uncomfortably. Where was this going? "I served with this man," Harrison continued. "He saved my life, carried me out of an ambush when I should have died in a rice paddy 50 years ago. I've been looking for him for decades, hoping to thank him properly." The tension in the room was palpable, and last night I found him. Harrison's eyes swept the room until they found Frank, still standing at the back. "He's been here for 5 years, working quietly, doing his job, asking for nothing. Frank felt the eyes of the room beginning to turn toward him. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the walls, like he'd learned to do so many years ago. "Some of you know him as Mop," Harrison said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Some of you call him Charlie. You've made jokes about his accent, his appearance, his past. You've treated him like he was the enemy." The silence in the room was deafening. Torres felt his stomach drop. Williams looked like he was going to be sick. "But you were wrong," Harrison continued. "This man, Frank Nguyen, call sign Dragon, is one of the most decorated allies this country has ever had, and you've been treating him like garbage." Harrison gestured toward Frank. "Would you please come forward, Frank?" Every head in the auditorium turned. Frank stood frozen for a moment, then slowly began walking down the aisle. His janitor's coveralls seemed impossibly loud in the silence, his footsteps echoing like gunshots. When he reached the stage, Harrison did something unprecedented. The colonel snapped to attention and rendered a perfect military salute. "Tiger 7 Dragon, it has been an honor." Frank, standing in his work clothes before hundreds of uniformed soldiers, slowly returned the salute. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and strong. "Tiger 7 Base, the honor was mine." Not in applause, but in the rustle of hundreds of soldiers rising to their feet and snapping to attention. The salute rippled through the crowd like a wave, spreading from the front rows to the back until every person in the room was standing at attention, saluting the man they'd spent years ignoring. Torres was crying. Williams looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but Frank just stood there, straight and dignified, accepting the recognition he'd never asked for, but had always deserved. When the salute finally ended and the room sat back down, Harrison continued. "Dragon here earned his call sign, not just because of the tattoo he carries, but because of what he did with it. The dragon in Vietnamese culture represents wisdom, strength, and protection. That's exactly what Frank provided to dozens of American soldiers who came home because of his actions." Harrison turned to address Frank directly. "The military has a lot of problems, Frank. We don't always take care of our own, and we're even worse at taking care of our allies. But that changes today. Your service will be recognized, your sacrifices will be honored, and anyone who disrespects you will answer to me personally." Frank nodded once, his composure intact, despite the emotion visible in his eyes. Harrison addressed the room again. "I want every person in this auditorium to remember this moment. Remember that heroes don't always look like what you expect. They don't always speak like you or come from where you come from. Sometimes they push mop buckets and clean your messes, and ask for nothing in return except basic human dignity." The change was immediate and profound. In the days that followed, Frank's life at the base transformed completely. Soldiers who had ignored him for years went out of their way to speak with him respectfully. Torres and his group formally apologized, with Torres himself requesting a transfer to another base, not in anger, but in shame that took him months to overcome. Frank kept his job, but with a new title, Base Historical Consultant. His official duties remained the same, but now, when new recruits arrived, they learned about the quiet man who worked among them and what real service looked like. The tattoo behind his ear was no longer hidden. When soldiers asked about it, respectfully now, Frank would tell them about the Phoenix program, about the South Vietnamese forces who fought alongside Americans, about allies who were forgotten when the war ended. 3 months later, something remarkable happened. A delegation arrived from Vietnam, official diplomats working on veteran outreach programs between the two countries. When they learned about Frank, they came to the base specifically. Afterward, Colonel Tran addressed the base personnel. In Vietnam, we have not forgotten the LLDB forces who worked with American soldiers, she said through a translator. Men like Frank Nguyen are honored in our country as heroes, who tried to build bridges between our peoples. To learn that he has been here, working quietly, continuing to serve, it shows the character that made him legendary. She turned to Frank and spoke again in Vietnamese. The translator relayed her words. She says that in Vietnam, dragons are eternal. They may sleep, but they never die, and true dragons always recognize each other. That evening, Frank sat in the same recreation room where he'd once been mocked. But now soldiers approached him differently. They asked about Vietnam, about the war, about what it was like to serve in joint operations. Frank answered their questions patiently, sharing stories he'd kept buried for decades. The hardest part, he told one young private, was not the fighting, was coming to America and being seen as the enemy by people I had bled to protect. The private, barely older than Frank had been when he first went to war, listened intently. "But you stayed," the soldier said. "You kept serving, even when they treated you badly." Frank nodded. Service is not about being recognized, it is about doing what is right, even when no one sees. He paused, looking around the room at faces that now showed respect instead of mockery. "But recognition," he added quietly, "recognition is nice too." Harrison, who had been listening from across the room, approached Frank as the evening wound down. "Any regrets?" the colonel asked. Frank considered the question carefully. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret that it took so long for young soldiers to learn that there are many ways to serve your country, many ways to be a hero." "And now they know," Harrison said. Frank smiled, the first genuine smile many of the soldiers had ever seen from him. Now they know. Some stories take 50 years to tell properly. Frank Nguyen had spent half a century carrying the weight of a war that ended badly, of alliances that were forgotten, of service that went unrecognized. He'd endured mockery and prejudice from the very people he'd once risked his life to save. But in the end, truth has a way of surfacing. Heroes have a way of being recognized, even when they don't seek recognition. And dragons, as Colonel Tran had said, are eternal. Frank continued working at Fort Braxton for 3 more years, before finally retiring at age 76. At his retirement ceremony, soldiers from 3 different generations. His final words to the assembled troops were simple. "Remember that your allies come in many forms. Respect them all. You never know when the person you overlook might be the one who saves your life." So now I ask you, have you ever dismissed someone because of how they looked or sounded? Have you ever realized too late that you are in the presence of greatness? Share your story in the comments. Let their names be heard, because here at Still Human, we believe that heroes walk among us every day. Sometimes they wear uniforms. Sometimes they carry mop buckets. But they all deserve our respect, our recognition, and our gratitude. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to Still Human. Help us ensure that stories like Frank's stories of service, sacrifice, and the allies we forgot to honor are never forgotten again. We'll see you in the next one, and until then, remember, the person cleaning your floors might once have saved lives. The immigrant with the accent might be a war hero. The quiet worker you overlook might be the most decorated soldier you'll ever meet. Look closer, listen better, honor them all. Still human, because behind every uniform, every job, every quiet life, there's a story worth telling.